We are counting down 22 lost freedoms and places that once defined Black life in the 1980s. From vanishing hangout rituals and music traditions to the quiet shutdown of beloved community venues, each entry reveals how cultural connection was gradually erased, often without anyone noticing. Some of these losses are subtle, others shake the roots of how people met, celebrated, and thrived together. Which forgotten tradition ranks as the biggest loss? Let us begin with number 22. On Friday nights in the 1980s, roller rinks like World on Wheels in Los Angeles and Empire Rollerdrome in Brooklyn came alive with slow jams and the low hum of anticipation. The lights would dim, the DJ would cue up a request, maybe Anita Baker, maybe Luther Vandross, and couples of all ages would glide together under the disco ball. For Black teens, these nights weren't just about skating. They were one of the few places where you could meet someone, hold hands, and share a first dance surrounded by friends, parents, and even grandparents. Rinks served as neutral ground, safe and open to everyone, no matter your background. But as the 1980s gave way to the 1990s, that world began to vanish. Rinks started closing at a rate of 3 per month across the country, squeezed by rising insurance costs, city budget cuts, and the pressures of gentrification. What was once an affordable communal dating space faded away, leaving a generation without a place to gather, connect, or even hear their favorite slow jam played just for them. Backyards and living rooms once filled with the sound of slow jams and laughter, as friends and neighbors gathered for house parties that stretched into the night. A mixtape might set the mood, May's SOS Band, or a quiet cut from Anita Baker, while couples found a corner for a slow dance, far from watchful eyes. But by the late 1980s, these private gatherings faced new threats. In 1988, the LAPD raided apartments on Dalton Avenue, smashing furniture and detaining dozens without charges. Over 90% of those arrested in such raids were released, but the message was clear: even your own home wasn't safe for celebration. Landlords began adding strict clauses to leases, banning parties outright. Cities rolled out hefty fines for hosts. The freedom to turn a backyard into a sanctuary for music and connection quietly slipped away, replaced by fear of a knock at the door. School hallways once echoed with the sound of live horns, woodwinds, and drums, and every student had a chance to pick up an instrument, join the band, and learn from teachers who saw music as more than just an elective. In the early 1980s, that changed. Across the country, public schools began slashing arts budgets, with the sharpest cuts hitting Black neighborhoods hardest. Between 1981 and 1989, federal support for arts education plummeted. Instruments that once lined classroom shelves were sold off at auction to cover shortfalls. Teachers remember watching their programs shrink year after year until only a handful of students could participate, if any. The rollback of Title IV. A funding meant fewer school bands, fewer orchestras, and fewer chances for young Black musicians to learn their craft for free. What was once a pipeline for talent, feeding soul, funk, and R&B groups dried up. The impact rippled out: fewer live bands at school dances, fewer kids dreaming of the stage, and a generation left without the tools to carry the music forward. Earth, Wind, and Fire, the Commodores and the Gap Band once packed stadiums with horn sections, tight rhythm guitars, and singers who could lift a crowd to its feet. In the 1980s, Black bands like these were not just entertainers, they were entire communities on stage, each member a master of their craft. Local and regional R&B and funk groups thrived, playing clubs, skating rinks, and high school gyms, giving young musicians a path from neighborhood talent shows to national tours. But by the mid-1980s, the music industry priorities shifted. Record labels, once eager to sign full ensembles, began slashing studio budgets. multi-piece bands were quietly dropped in favor of solo acts and producers who could work with drum machines and synthesizers. A&R executives, chasing the new sound of sampling, saw less need for 6 or 7 musicians when a single producer and a sampler could cut costs and deliver hits faster. Interviews with musicians from that era recall contracts drying up and rehearsal spaces going dark. The industry pivot meant fewer opportunities for Black musicians who learned their craft in school bands or local jam sessions. The pipeline that once turned school talent into professional careers was broken, and the sound of live horns and bass lines faded from both the stage and the radio. The loss rippled out. Without bands to look up to, fewer kids picked up instruments, and the communal spirit of the ensemble began to disappear, replaced by the solitary beat of a drum machine. Late nights once belonged to the quiet storm. In 1976, Melvin Lindsay, a Howard University student, sat behind the mic at WHUR in Washington, D.C., and spun a set of slow, soulful tracks that felt like velvet after midnight. His show, named for Smokey Robinson's 1975 hit, turned into a movement. Within a decade, Quiet Storm was the soundtrack of Black America's evenings, from DC to New York, Chicago to San Francisco. By the mid-1980s, more than 200 stations across the country carried the format, each with local DJs curating playlists that reflected their city's flavor. Listeners would call in requests, dedicate songs to lovers, and discover new artists breaking through on the strength of late-night spins. But that intimacy didn't last. The Telecommunications Act of 1996 opened the door for corporate giants to buy up local stations, replacing homegrown DJs with syndicated playlists and cutting off the pipeline for local talent. Quiet Storm became a brand, stripped of its roots. The slow jams still played, but the voices behind them, once neighbors, activists, and tastemakers, were replaced by distant, faceless automation. What was once a nightly ritual of connection became just another product, and the power to shape the sound of Black love stories slipped away from the community that created it. On any Saturday in the 1980s, a Black-owned record store was more than a place to buy music. It was a neighborhood hub, alive with conversation, discovery, and the thrill of a new 12-inch single. Stores like Dorsey's Records in Pittsburgh or Record Shack in Detroit kept the latest rhythm and blues, soul, and funk on hand, and the owner likely knew every customer by name. DJs would come in to dig through crates, searching for a rare groove or the next party anthem. Young musicians found inspiration flipping through album covers, imagining their band's name in the racks one day. But as the decade closed, the rise of national chains and big box retailers pushed out independent shops. By 1995, 60% of Black-owned record stores had shuttered, squeezed by corporate buying power and the loss of direct distribution deals. The loss was not just economic, it cut off a vital pipeline for local artists and DJs, and with each closure, a piece of communal memory faded. The retail landscape shifted, and with it, the chance to stumble onto something new, guided by someone who understood the music and the people it spoke to. Before the internet, club DJs held the keys to what the neighborhood heard next. On a Friday night in the 1980s, a DJ could break a new record before it ever hit the radio. If you were not at the club or in the record store, you missed it. These tastemakers built their playlists by swapping white label promos and rare cuts at record pools, scribbling new finds into battered ledgers. DJs like a young Dijon McFarlane, years before he became DJ Mustard, tagged along with older heads in Los Angeles, watching them trade stacks of vinyl and argue over which track would move the crowd. Record pool nights were part business, part secret society. Labels sent promo crates, hoping the right DJ would spin their artists and set off a local craze. The result? Each city had its own sound, shaped by the hands and ears of people who lived there. Once music went digital and record pools disappeared, that power faded. Algorithms replaced human curators, and the club DJ lost their place as the gatekeeper of what's next. Small Black-owned clubs once fueled entire music scenes, booking local talent and keeping dance floors packed deep into the night. In the late 1980s, that world began to unravel, not because the crowds disappeared, but because the cost of doing business soared out of reach. Venue owners opened their mail to find their liability insurance premiums had jumped, sometimes tripling between 1985 and 1990. For a Southside Chicago club, an annual policy that once cost $3,000 suddenly ran to more than $10,000. Promoters faced new permit fees, stricter fire codes, and city inspectors who showed up with a checklist and a threat. Contracts with artists grew riskier, as a single incident could void coverage or force a shutdown. Some owners tried to pass the costs on by raising ticket prices, but that only drove regulars away. Others cut back on live acts, switching to DJs or closing altogether. What had been a steady path for Black entrepreneurship, owning a club, booking shows, and building a legacy turned into a minefield of paperwork and red ink. The squeeze on independent venues didn't just silence stages, it choked off the pipeline for new talent and left neighborhoods with fewer places to gather, dance, and dream. Neighborhood recreation centers once buzzed with music after school, where kids could pick up a bass or trumpet and learn from mentors who saw potential in every child. These weren't just music lessons, they were lifelines. Local musicians, retired teachers, and church volunteers ran programs on shoestring budgets, teaching everything from jazz standards to gospel harmonies. By 1984, federal community grants had been slashed by nearly 30%. Youth centers in cities like Detroit and Oakland shut their doors after decades of service, unable to survive the funding drought. IRS filings from the era show a wave of nonprofits dissolving or merging, with their missions cut short by shrinking support. A former mentor remembers the heartbreak of turning kids away, knowing there was nowhere else for them to go. The loss ran deeper than lost notes. Without these grassroots programs, the pipeline that once carried young talent from the block to the big stage dried up. What remained was a hollowed-out shell. It happened just as the war on drugs began to target the very neighborhoods that had lost their last safe havens. In 1986, Congress passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, introducing mandatory minimum sentences that swept thousands of Black men and women into the prison system. A single arrest, sometimes for as little as 5 grams of crack cocaine, could mean years behind bars, no matter the circumstances. These laws did not just punish individuals. They tore entire families out of neighborhoods overnight. In cities like Detroit, Chicago, and Los Angeles, it became common for friends to vanish from block parties, church choirs, and basketball courts, replaced by silence and empty chairs. By 1995, the Bureau of Justice Statistics reported a 400% increase in the incarceration rate for Black men since 1980. The numbers on a graph tell a story of disappearance: fathers missing from dinner tables, mentors gone from youth centers, musicians absent from bands that once played every Friday night. Michelle Alexander would later call this era the birth of a new Jim Crow, where the war on drugs functioned as a pipeline from the street to the cell. The loss rippled out in every direction. Venues shut their doors for lack of performers and audiences. After-school programs struggled to find volunteers. A generation grew up without the guidance of older cousins, uncles, and neighbors who once anchored the community. What was once a network of support and creativity became a patchwork of empty spaces, each one a reminder of who and what was taken away. In neighborhoods where crossing the wrong street could mean trouble, there were once places that stood apart from the violence. Church basements, recreation centers, and even certain school gyms were declared safe zones, neutral ground where rival crews agreed to leave their conflicts at the door. In Chicago, pastors and youth leaders brokered truces so teens from different blocks could dance together at Friday night socials. No colors, no fights. These venues became sanctuaries, watched over by adults who knew every face and could sense tension before it sparked. Former mediators remember making calls to both sides, setting the rules, and standing in the doorway until everyone got home safe. For a few hours, music and laughter drowned out everything else. But as funding dried up and leaders were swept away by the wave of arrests in the late 1980s and early 1990s, those safe spaces started to close. Without neutral ground, even simple gatherings became risky. The loss of these venues left a void that no security camera or after-school program could fill, a gap in the community where trust and safety once lived. Tour buses once rumbled across the Midwest and South every weekend, carrying Black bands from one city hall or ballroom to the next. Local promoters booked these acts months in advance, filling calendars with steady gigs that kept musicians working and entire communities dancing. The American Federation of Musicians regional logs from 1988 show a sharp drop. By the mid-1990s, half the weekend dates had vanished from the books. Promoters, squeezed by rising costs and shrinking venue access, stopped taking risks on up-and-coming groups. Instead of a packed itinerary, musicians found empty weekends and canceled shows. The loss of these circuits hit hard. Fewer bookings meant less money for bands and crews, and fewer chances for young artists to learn the ropes on stage. For many, the dream of making a living through music faded as the local circuit collapsed. Those once reliable routes between small towns and city centers became ghost trails, leaving a generation of performers with nowhere to play and no one to play for. Musicians in Detroit once counted on city-owned rehearsal halls and municipal auditoriums as lifelines. These public spaces offered a place to practice, put on a show, or just gather with fellow artists, all for a fee most bands could actually afford. But in the early 1990s, that changed almost overnight. City council minutes from Detroit show a wave of privatization deals and budget maneuvers. By 1994, booking fees for public halls had more than doubled compared to just 4 years earlier. Where a community group could once rent a hall for a weekend rehearsal or a local showcase, now the cost was out of reach. Musicians recall being told to clear out, replaced by private bookings or corporate events. In some neighborhoods, the last affordable practice space was gone for good. Losing these halls meant more than canceled gigs. It pulled the rug out from under every kind of community event, from gospel choir rehearsals to neighborhood talent shows. The sale of public spaces did not just hurt artists, it cut off the roots of Black culture at the local level, making it harder for new voices to come together and be heard. Prom season once meant the whole neighborhood getting involved. In the 1980s, high school gyms and church halls transformed into ballrooms, with decorations made by hand and playlists that mixed Luther Vandross with Frankie Beverly. Tickets cost less than a new pair of sneakers, and nobody worried about dress codes or security checkpoints. After the last dance, families gathered at the park for cookouts, grills fired up, card tables set, and kids darting between picnic blankets. These gatherings weren't just parties, they were rites of passage where elders passed down stories and couples slow danced under the stars. But by the early 1990s, the rules changed. City permit offices became a maze, and the wait time to reserve a public park or recreation center tripled between 1985 and 1992. PTA minutes from Detroit and Atlanta show parents frustrated as paperwork piled up and costs soared. Without affordable access, proms moved to expensive hotels and cookouts faded. The loss left a hole in the calendar and in the community's heart, where traditions used to live. Every Saturday morning, the hum of clippers and the scent of hot combs signaled more than just a fresh cut or a new style. Black barbershops and beauty salons in the 1980s were the heartbeat of the neighborhood, a place where news traveled faster than any headline, and everybody had a seat at the table. On any given day, you could hear a high school debate about city politics, a grandmother sharing recipes, or a young man getting advice before a job interview. These shops doubled as unofficial town halls, where the community hashed out everything from local elections to block party plans. As the 1990s rolled in, things changed. Economic shifts, scattered longtime customers, and rising rents forced more than a third of these shops to close between 1990 and 2000. Stylists who once knew 3 generations of a family watched as their regulars moved away or stopped coming altogether. One barber from Detroit recalled that it wasn't just about the haircut, it was about hearing what was going on, about being heard. Without these hubs, the neighborhood lost a place where voices mattered and ideas took root. The loss left a silence that is hard to fill with pop-up shops or online forums, no matter how flashy the marketing. Once, summer afternoons meant block parties that stretched from one end of the street to the other. Neighbors dragged out grills, set up folding tables, and wired speakers to lampposts so the whole block could move to the same groove. Permits were easy to get, just a quick trip to the city clerk's office, a handshake, maybe a small fee. But by the late 1980s, the rules changed. In 1989, a new loitering ordinance in places like Chicago gave police broad authority to disperse crowds, even when everyone had a permit in hand. Permit logs show a steep decline. By 1993, the number of approved block parties in major cities had dropped by nearly 40%. Some neighborhoods tried to keep the tradition alive, but the paperwork piled up and the risk of fines grew. What was once a spontaneous celebration of community turned into a maze of red tape. The loss of these street festivals did not just silence the music, it chipped away at the sense of belonging that tied neighbors together, making public celebration feel more like a privilege than a right. Neighborhood newspapers once landed on doorsteps with pages packed full of local events, church fish fries, talent shows, and classified ads for everything from yard sales to band auditions. For Black communities in the 1980s, these listings were more than ink on paper. They were the pulse of the block, the way you found out where to be and who was hiring. An editor from Chicago remembers entire columns devoted to block parties, club gigs, and instrument shops looking for new talent. But as print advertising dollars dried up, classified pages began to vanish. Between 1987 and 1996, the number of classified ads in major city papers shrank by 70%. With that decline, the neighborhood lost its main source for discovering local events and opportunities. Suddenly, flyers had nowhere to go, and weekend plans were harder to make. Information that once flowed freely was replaced by silence, leaving people disconnected and small businesses struggling to reach their own neighbors. Without those columns, the community's calendar went blank, and the next chapter of connection became even harder to write. A regular at the corner pool hall could count on the same faces every Saturday, old-timers swapping stories, teens learning trick shots, and the steady clack of balls echoing beneath a haze of cigarette smoke. These halls, along with veteran clubs and social lodges, were the backbone of neighborhood leisure. But as the late 1980s rolled in, the ground shifted. Lease agreements that had held steady for years suddenly jumped, sometimes by as much as 60% between 1986 and 1992. Owners opened their renewal letters to find rents doubled, with no warning and no chance to negotiate. City records from that era show a spike in vice citations and new policing ordinances, making it harder for these spots to stay open late or serve the regulars who kept the lights on. One owner in Cleveland watched his club's rent go from $800 to nearly $1,300 overnight, forcing him to close after 3 decades. The loss of these spaces was not about luxury, it was about losing a place where Anyone could pull up a chair, play a hand of cards, and feel like they belonged. With every closure, another thread of everyday connection snapped, leaving fewer places to gather without spending a fortune or needing an invitation. A generation ago, every city directory listed a dozen places where a kid could rent a trumpet or take a lesson after school. Local instrument shops lined main streets in Detroit, Chicago, and Atlanta, their windows filled with saxophones, clarinets, and drum kits waiting for new hands. Private music teachers tacked business cards to church bulletin boards and ran ads in the classifieds, offering lessons in homes or tiny studios above the corner store. By 2000, more than half of those shops were gone. Urban music stores fell by 55% between 1985 and the turn of the century. The ripple was immediate. Without easy access to affordable rentals or face-to-face instruction, learning an instrument became a privilege, not a rite of passage. Teacher guilds noted the drop in new students, especially in Black neighborhoods, where school programs had already been gutted. The Yellow Pages, once thick with listings for piano and guitar teachers, thinned to a handful of names. For families, the loss meant fewer chances for kids to discover their sound, and for communities, it meant one more door to creativity quietly close. In the 1980s, a young band with a dream could walk into a local record label and get heard, sometimes even signed, by an A and R rep who lived in the same city and knew the scene firsthand. These independent labels were the lifeblood of Black music, scouting talent at church picnics, block parties, and talent nights, then cutting deals that kept the sound rooted in the neighborhood. Billboard's indie charts from the era read like a roll call of regional heroes and breakout groups, acts that might never have made it past the lobby at a corporate label. But as the decade closed, the ground shifted. Major companies began swallowing up the small labels, and the number of new signings collapsed. By 1994, signings at indie labels had dropped by 70% compared to a decade earlier. A&R memos from the early 1990s warned of shrinking budgets and roster cuts. Where once dozens of local acts filled a label's calendar, now only a handful made the cut, and most were solo artists or producers who could work fast and cheap. The loss of these indie labels didn't just mean fewer records on the shelves. It severed the capital pipeline that once turned neighborhood talent into national stars. With fewer scouts on the ground and less money to go around, the next Earth, Wind, and Fire, or Gap Band, never even got a chance to rehearse, let alone record. The label rosters that once read like a map of Black America grew thin, and the archives of local music, master tapes, demo reels, even handwritten lyrics were boxed up, lost, or tossed. The industry's consolidation closed doors that had always been just barely open, leaving a generation of musicians on the outside, looking in. In a small locked room at a local radio station, rows of tape reels once held the living memory of Black music, rare recordings, live performances, and playlists that told the story of a community in real time. DJs built their sets from these archives, piecing together nights that defined eras and introduced new voices to the world. But in 1998, thousands of reels were tossed out overnight when a major station changed hands. Decades of music, interviews, and community broadcasts ended up in dumpsters, their labels peeling in the rain. Some private collectors scrambled to save what they could, but most of the archive vanished without a trace. The Library of Congress has tried to gather what remains, but the bulk of those lost tapes, local bands, community announcements, and unreleased tracks are gone for good. For Black communities, these station vaults and DJ libraries were more than storage rooms. They were a living record of Black creativity, struggle, and celebration. DJs curated not just songs, but memories, mixes that marked birthdays, block parties, and the first time a new artist's song hit the air. Losing these archives means losing the soundtrack of everyday life, the proof that it all happened. Without these recordings, whole chapters of cultural history are erased, leaving only fragments in the hands of a few collectors or buried in forgotten corners of the Library of Congress. The silence left behind is more than the absence of music. It is the loss of a primary cultural memory, the kind that once tied generations together and gave context to every slow jam, every anthem, every voice that mattered. Slow jams once acted as the heartbeat of Black courtship, weaving together every layer of community life. In the 1980s, a single slow song could change the course of a night, whether it was at the skating rink, a friend's living room, or a high school dance. The moment the DJ called for a slow jam, everything shifted. Teens who spent most of the evening in nervous clusters finally crossed the floor. Hands reached out, eyes met, and the whole room seemed to hold its breath. The first slow dance, the first kiss. These moments weren't just rites of passage. They were the foundation for friendships, relationships, and stories that lasted decades. What made this possible was a network of spaces and rituals that supported face-to-face connection. Skating rinks, house parties, school dances, neighborhood rec centers, and even late-night radio all worked together, creating a web where everyone knew the cues. The DJ played a slow jam, the lights dimmed, and the crowd understood. This was the time to be brave, to ask someone to dance, to risk rejection in public, but also to feel the safety of being surrounded by your own. Parents and elders watched from the sidelines, offering advice or gentle teasing, but always protecting the space. Even the music itself was built for this. Long intros, lush harmonies, lyrics about love and vulnerability. Over time, each link in this chain was quietly removed. Roller rinks closed, house parties became targets for police, school arts programs lost funding, and radio stations replaced local DJs with syndicated playlists. The communal calendar of slow jam rituals disappeared, replaced by digital platforms where everything is filtered, curated, and isolated. Today, most young people meet through apps, swiping left or right in silence, rarely sharing a dance or a song in real time. National surveys show that Generation Z is less likely than any previous generation to meet partners in person, and many say they feel unprepared for face-to-face romance. The old network of slow jam matchmaking is gone, and with it, the organic pathways that once brought people together. This loss isn't just about nostalgia for a certain sound or scene. It's about the dismantling of a communal support system that made love and friendship possible in public, out loud, and together. When the slow jam faded, so did the freedom to gather, to risk, and to connect without fear or surveillance. What's left is a longing for spaces where the music, the crowd, and the courage to ask for a dance all belong to us, and the hope that somehow those spaces can be reclaimed. Across all 22 entries, one pattern stands out. The slow erasure of Black spaces and freedoms wasn't an accident. It was by design. Policy shifts, corporate consolidation, and policing quietly dismantled the everyday joys and connections that held communities together. That loss shapes Black life today, making what was once ordinary now feel out of reach. Cultural memory matters because erasure isn't just history, it's ongoing. What is lost shapes who we become. Drop your thoughts below.